Thank you so much, Mark, for that introduction, and also thank you for this wonderful invitation to come here and present at really this absolutely stunning facility. It's for both of us our first time in Hong Kong. And thank you, Mark, and also Angela, for all that you've done to arrange our visit. You put a lot of work in, and we really appreciate everything, and everything has gone so well. So as you all know, we're here to talk about the Oriental Institute, to sort of give you an overview of what we do, a little bit about our history, and some of the highlights of our research and projects. And as Mark mentioned, this is our centennial, so it's really an ideal time to introduce the public to our work, especially at our overseas centers, and really raise the visibility of the OI, particularly here in Hong Kong and in China. So what is the Oriental Institute? Well, the Oriental Institute, it's a unit of the University of Chicago. It's an interdisciplinary research center and a renowned museum. Our work really consists of two parts. It's archaeological. We have excavations, field projects throughout the Middle East. Currently, we sponsor 12 field projects in the Middle East. And the other half of it is textual, meaning this is sort of linguistic fieldwork. People who do what I do basically read texts that archaeologists find, and we use those texts to reconstruct histories, literatures, religions, and the socioeconomic institutions of these ancient civilizations. As Mark mentioned, we also have a world-class, world-renowned museum that stems from our research with 350,000 artifacts, making it the largest collection of its kind in the United States and one of the largest in the world. And we have about 5,000 of those on display in our museum, and you're going to hear more about our museum from Jean. If you're ever in Chicago, we certainly hope that you'll come down to Hyde Park and pay us a visit. So the OI was founded 100 years ago by James Henry Breasted, and Breasted was the first American to receive a doctorate in Egyptology. He's the first American Egyptologist. He received it in Berlin. And Breasted had a really radical idea at the time, namely that who we are, how we live as humans together, began, at least in the West, not in Greece and Rome, as so many people suppose, but in the ancient Middle East, and in an area that he vividly called the Fertile Crescent. The University of Chicago has been a center for ancient Middle Eastern studies ever since its founding in 1890. And one of the reasons for that is that the first president of the University of Chicago, William Rainey Harper, was himself what was called at the time a Semitist. He was basically somebody who was interested in the Bible and biblical languages and the context of the Bible. And his brother went on to become another very prominent early ancient Near Eastern scholar. And Breasted actually trained under Harper. When Harper became president of this fledgling University of Chicago, he hired Breasted to come there and fill a position as the first Egyptologist in the United States. Now, Breasted, he was at Chicago for about 25 years before he was able to secure funding for the Oriental Institute. You can see Breasted and his family here visiting Egypt. Breasted was a very special character. He was a visionary, somebody of great energy and vision. And one of the things that he was very keenly interested in was in popularizing the ancient Middle East. He sort of understood that for the fields to really succeed, the general public had to have some knowledge of them. And this was important for patronage, this was important for philanthropy, and really he introduced, through his popular works such as Ancient Times, he introduced generations of people throughout the world to these fields. He really was the voice for these fields. And he understood that for these fields to be studied appropriately, you really needed a robust research institute that could study them on a scale and scope that had never really been attempted before. And he set out to do that when he created the Oriental Institute. Here you can see another image here. We're showing you here, this is sort of the foundational document for the Oriental Institute. As maybe some of you know, the University of Chicago was founded with a gift by the Rockefellers, by John D. Rockefeller. And in fact, Rockefeller's son who gave the foundational gift for the Oriental Institute. And this was the letter that that Rockefeller wrote to Breasted promising the initial grant that would make the OI a reality. And finally, here you can see Breasted in Egypt. He was sort of an adventurous character. Maybe some of you know that the character of Indiana Jones is inspired by Oriental Institute archaeologists. Breasted was one of the figures that Indiana Jones was likely based on, and another one was Robert Braidwood. And actually, if we turn to the next slide, you could sort of see a little bit of the rationale behind that. When Rockefeller endowed the Oriental Institute, making it possible, Breasted immediately went on an epic 11-month trip throughout the Middle East with a group of scholars. You can see up here at the top, a group of scholars from the University of Chicago. And he wanted to sort of seek out places where the Oriental Institute, this new institute that he had created, where it could do field work and establish long-term field projects. And really, timing was everything. This was 1919, World War I had just ended, the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, and this had really opened up this entire region to study in the way that it hadn't been before. But it also came with its own dangers, right? People were living in the wake of the collapsed Ottoman state. The French and English had mandates in this territory. Of course, there are issues between some of the local tribes and the English and the French. It was sort of a wild west, to give an American metaphor, region. And Breasted had this sort of epic journey that took 11 months where he begins in Cairo, he heads down the Red Sea, he goes all the way to Bombay, and then starts heading up the Persian Gulf, up through Iraq, looking for sites. And this became some of the foundational work for where the OI would conduct its research in the future. In fact, some of the very first publications of the Oriental Institute stemmed from this trip. And along the way, he was also collecting artifacts that became the basis of the fledgling museum. So next, I'm going to hand it over to Jean, who will talk a little bit about our museum, which was created at this very time.
Right. So as Chris has been telling you, the Oriental Institute may be 100 years old, but the university was interested in the ancient Middle East even before that. And so there had been a collection of antiquities from the Middle East at the University of Chicago, and it was in a place called Haskell Museum. But you can also see, this is the outside of the building, and here's one of the galleries, that it was actually an eclectic mix of materials. There were collections from the Divinity School, from comparative religions, and so forth, and they were all housed together. And one of the things that James Henry Breasted did at the University of Chicago shortly after the founding of the Oriental Institute is that he embarked upon the plan to build a new building to house the Institute. And so the Oriental Institute Museum in its current location opened in 1931. And by that time, as a result of that expedition in 1919-1920, the OI had major archaeological expeditions all across the Middle East, and they were receiving a division of finds at the end of these excavation seasons. And so one of the things that makes us unique from other institutions, not only do we have 350,000 artifacts, making it the largest collection of Middle Eastern antiquities, but the majority of them were excavated. And so when you see the galleries, you're seeing, in a sense, highlights. We have a huge amount of archaeological material, and this material is tied to excavation records, and we host researchers from all over the world who still come and look at our collections and look at our archival documents, and they still study these old digs that were so foundational, not only for the Oriental Institute, but for the entire field of ancient Middle Eastern archaeology. We recently completed a multi-million-dollar reinstallation of the galleries. The galleries hadn't been reinstalled for nearly 3 decades, and we just opened to the public on September 28th, so not even a month ago. One of the things that happened was that a lot of the display cases in the museum prior to this reinstallation, they dated back to the opening of the museum in 1931. And so the project began 5 years ago with this idea of updating the display cases, but of course, it soon became apparent to us that we wanted to do much more than that. And here you just see a view of the Mesopotamia gallery and a view of the Egyptian gallery. And we have 7 galleries at the museum, but the main galleries and the main focus of our research really are Mesopotamia and Egypt. So when we reinstalled the museum, as I said, it was an opportunity to think more about the collection and how we were presenting the material. And one thing that we wanted to be able to stress over and over again, we always say that in the museum we have things that you can't miss, like a huge statue of King Tut, but we also have things that you shouldn't miss, and that's sort of a chance to learn about archaeology and to understand the connection between the material you're seeing in the galleries and the work of the OI. So whenever possible, we tried to add these features where we told stories about the digs themselves, just to emphasize this relationship between OI research and archaeology and the formation of the collection. And we also wanted people to understand issues that continue to go on in the Middle East today in terms of the cultural heritage and the looting of archaeological sites and so forth. We also had an opportunity to bring out new objects, and so some 500 new objects that have never before been on display in the galleries are now on display. This is a very dramatic example. It's a large, important relief from the site of Persepolis. But what makes it such an interesting story, at least for us, is that it had been on display in Boston ever since it was excavated. It was part of a long-term loan. So we always knew that this relief was part of our collection, but we had never displayed it in Chicago before. And so the Centennial was a great opportunity to take on and tackle some of these larger objects and bring them out and put them in the gallery, and in this case, put them with other monuments from the same site that the OI had excavated. In addition, just to thinking about new objects, there was this larger issue of the ways that the galleries are arranged. And we were able to carve out some new spaces in the museum. And one thing that was important to us was to bring out part of the collection that dates to the Islamic period. We, of course, study primarily the ancient past, and that break traditionally occurs at the arrival of Islam. But it's a reality that we have a huge collection of Islamic artifacts that were excavated just as the ancient material was excavated. And so we really wanted to bring that out and show the role of the OI also in pioneering Islamic archaeology as a discipline, and also just to draw connections closer to the region today. So, Mesopotamia is ancient Iraq, but we could make that relationship more explicit by showing Islamic period material. And this is an unassuming fragment, but it's actually one of the more important objects in our collection. It's a paper fragment from the earliest surviving copy of 1001 Nights. And you can see that it's scribbled all over. It was just a piece of paper, and it kept getting reused again and again until finally it was someone witnessed a contract and signed to say they'd witnessed it, and they dated it to 879 AD, and that's how we know that this copy of 1001 Nights dates to before that. So here's another example of a new space, and this is installed the way it is now in celebration of the centennial. But these smaller spaces are great because, you won't undertake a museum reinstallation, that frequently, but this allows us to refresh the content in small, meaningful ways. And so this is by a contemporary artist, this colorful part that you're seeing. And this is a reconstruction of an Assyrian relief. And this was an opportunity for us to collaborate with this artist because we had a fragment of the relief in the collection, and he was able to reconstruct it. And he does this using Iraqi newspaper and food packaging, and his interest is in highlighting things that have been lost, and so this talks about cultural heritage issues and so on and so forth. And this is another dramatic project that we realized that's currently on display, where the artist Anne Hamilton, who's a MacArthur Genius Award recipient and very celebrated contemporary artist, she came and worked on our collection about a year ago, and she made her own sort of wand scans of artifacts, just sort of by putting the wand close to the artifacts, but not on them. And she produced these very large atmospheric prints, which she then put in the dome of Mansueto Library. So this is a great way for us to kind of take our material outside of the Oriental Institute building itself and reach a larger audience. And then finally, with this example, this is a Syrian artist and architect named Mohammed Hafez, and you see his work here. He makes these very surrealistic streetscapes and urban models, and he's interested in the conflict that's going on in Syria and the resulting refugee crisis. And again, it's just important to us that we draw connections between these ancient artifacts and what's going on in the Middle East today. And so this was another way that we could do that.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of our archaeological field projects, highlighting just a couple of them. So as I mentioned in the beginning, over the course of the last century, the OI has excavated sites spanning, as you can see in this map, all the way from Tunisia to Iran, and each one of these yellow points represents an excavation that the OI has conducted. And as you can see, these have spanned from Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Turkey, Syria, and Israel. And they really have produced, in many instances, what are really the definitive data sets for understanding not only these sites, but also these entire regions, because these, in many cases, have been extensive excavations that have uncovered thousands of years of occupation, and they're used sort of as the benchmark for understanding these periods and regions. And we continue to do this work, sending out expeditions every single year to the Middle East. Currently we have about 12 expeditions that the OI sponsors. Here, this is just, you're not meant to actually read this, but just be impressed. This is a timeline of all of our archaeological projects, and this is something that Jean put together for our centennial. You know, a place as long-lived and as complex as the OI, we often don't have a good sense of our own history and how many projects we had, what were their durations. So a lot of work just went into understanding our own history, and this was one of the products of that effort. And really, the story of OI archaeology, it's quite interesting in the history of how archaeology is done and studied. You know, these fields really begin in the middle of the 19th century, and they really begin with sort of treasure hunters. You know, Europeans, French, English in particular, looking for monuments, looking for tablets, and sort of tunneling through the sites. And that sort of then gave way to this era of big archaeology, the sort of sending out of hundreds of workmen, these enormous workforces, uncovering sort of massive surface areas of sites. And the methods became more refined, and the data, the recording of data became more meticulous. And the OI sort of enters the picture right around this period, where this era of big archaeology. And the OI was really sort of instrumental in really fine-tuning the methodology and the meticulousness of excavation, and sort of introducing interdisciplinary scientific study of sort of faunal and botanical data sets. And now archaeology is done very differently in the current era. Like typically, teams are small, maybe 20, 30, 40 people in general, and the recording of data is meticulous, where you're looking at everything, sifting through sands, and deal with looking not to uncover vast areas, but uncover the areas that you are doing with great precision. The OI was really instrumental in that transition from big to basically scientific excavation. And for instance, just one of the sort of milestones in OI archaeology was our involvement in the discovery of carbon-14, or carbon dating, that's used worldwide, of course, to date organic materials based on the carbon-14 isotope. This was a discovery at the University of Chicago, and it was accomplished with samples that the OI had played a role in. So here we're just going to, Jen and I are going to highlight two excavations that are currently running at the OI. This first one, what you're looking at is a map, a Google map of southern Iraq. And what you're looking at, this is a site of Nippur in southern Iraq in Mesopotamia. And this was the OI's longest running archaeological field project. The OI began excavating the site in 1948. And this dig extended right through 1990, when work had to stop with the outbreak of the first Gulf War. It's been, for decades, impossible, as you can imagine, to work in Iraq, but we maintained the concession. We maintained guards on the site, so the site wouldn't be looted for 30 years. And now we have just gone back for the first time in 30 years. We just started excavating at this site. We had our first field season last year, and this is an incredibly important site because this was the religious capital of ancient Mesopotamia. And what you're looking at here is this mound here was the remnants of what's called a ziggurat in Mesopotamia. This is a stepped pyramid, and this dates to about 2100 BC. So this is a 4,000-year-old structure. And here you just have some of the finds from around that time, around 2100. This was this temple structure was the home of the god Enlil, who was the head of the Mesopotamian pantheon. And the ziggurat would have dominated the site. You can see here, this is what I took this picture on one of my first visits to Iraq. And you can see there's not much here to look at, but you could see here, this is what the excavation looked like. This picture is probably taken, I guess, in the 70s or 80s. And once you excavate one of these sites, to protect it, you backfill in the dirt again. So that's why you don't see these deep trenches. So now we're about to sort of embark on all of this work again. And I think this is, and what you're seeing here is our dig house. This was, looks like a modest structure, but it's actually quite large. And this is a structure where archaeologists will live, where they study objects, where they store objects. Our dig house we built in the 1960s, but it had been completely reclaimed by the desert. And over the course of the last 2 years, we restored this house, which is no small feat to do this work from Chicago in the middle of an Iraqi desert. You deal with questions on how do you pay an electric bill in Iraq? How do you get water? We have to have water sort of brought out to the site in tanks on a almost daily basis. How do you stay safe in a place like Iraq, which which can be pretty dicey. And here you can see we had a very small field season, and you can see Jean here with some of our field director, Abbas Alizada, working on our very first field season. And these were some of the trenches, sort of test trenches that they opened up. And we hope one day that this site will look like that picture you saw from the 80s that really was the result of 30 years of work. We hope that the situation in Iraq remains stable. The news, obviously, the last couple of months hasn't been so good, but when we were there last year, things were going very, very well, and we've had a lot of support from the Iraqi ministry officials. They worked very closely with us. They did a great job on keeping us safe in the country. And things were going so well that we thought that we might even expand the scope of our work in southern Iraq. And so you can see in this map here, there's Nippur in the upper left-hand corner. And there are two other very important sites very close to Nippur, and they're basically sort of suburbs of Nippur. One is a place called Tel Drehem, and this was a very important administrative capital around 2100 BC. It's hardly been excavated. And another site, it's called Tel Lehem. It's confusing because they have very similar sounding names. And this site hasn't really been excavated at all. And this was what we think a very, very important ancient city called Tumul, which would have been the home of the spouse of Enlil in Nippur, a goddess named Ninlil. And what's so special about these sites is that they haven't been excavated. And there's not a lot. It's easy to get to the early periods. Let's put it this way, that what happens at a lot of these Mesopotamian sites is you have a lot of occupation, and you have to dig down, like you saw in that one shot, dig down to get to the early periods. That requires a lot of resources and a lot of manpower. These sites were abandoned early in antiquity, so it's very easy to get to these much older levels. So we're hoping that work in Iraq continues.
Yeah, and so the other project that we wanted to highlight here, we're switching regions, and we're going to southern Egypt, where the Tel Edfu project has been going on for a little over 10 years. Now, when you zoom in on this site, and you'll see a picture of it in the next slide, there's a large Ptolemaic late period temple that dominates the site, but the OI excavations have focused on this area over here. And here, again, you see the excavations, and here's part of that large later temple. And what's interesting about these excavations is that it's a rare opportunity to study urbanism in ancient Egypt. When you think of the ancient Egyptians, right, you think of pyramids and temples. And that's true just because largely, of course, building them was a priority, and that's what has survived. But at Tel Edfu, there's a great opportunity to look at urbanism. And there's some 3,500 years of stratigraphy, so successive digging one level below the other, that can be explored at Tel Edfu. So here again, you see that temple. And this video looks at some of the more recent excavations that have been going on. In particular, Tel Edfu was a provincial capital. Here you see some large public buildings, and these buildings were related to Edfu's role as a starting point for expeditions to the eastern desert for mining. There's also were large granary silos on the site, and here you see a modern method for recording these granaries, making a 3D model. And most recently, a large urban villa has been uncovered at the site. You see this new recording technique, again, for modeling the excavations. It's highly accurate. In the corner of the main hall of this house was discovered a shrine to the worship of ancestors. And this archaeologist here is holding a statue of a seated scribe called the Scribe of Edfu. Here you see it again on the left. This is a portrait bust of a woman. It's very typical of these kinds of shrines. And then you see a couple of the Edfu elite, but their representation has been defaced. And then this is just one more project. You know, Chris spoke about some of the changes over time in archaeology. And so what's happening with this new project is something that's very typical of archaeology today. Here you see a huge archaeological mound. So this is the ancient ruins of a city. And what happened this past summer is that an excavator went out to the site and they surveyed the area around this mound. And so what happens when you do that is, in a very systematic way, you walk around the area and you pick up everything that you find on the surface. And so here you see the mound and you see two individuals walking around. And this can tell you a lot before you ever put a shovel in the ground. And here, using satellite imagery, they were able to map out, you see here in the colored areas, the greatest concentration of material that they could find. And they determined that the extent of this city is here, what you see circled in red. And that, in fact, if this is true, and it can be confirmed once the archaeology begins, this makes this one of the largest ancient sites in Turkey. So it's a very good candidate for future excavation, not only for the preservation we're seeing on the surface, but also because of this find last season.
Yeah, this is one of the sensational finds from last season. It's remarkable that this was made in like the very first seasons. Usually you have to invest a lot more work to find something like this. But this was, what you're looking at here is an inscribed boulder that was found on the surface. In fact, our team was out there and they're collecting samples from the surface, as Jean described, and they ran into a farmer who said, oh, I found a few years ago a boulder with some sort of very strange writing on it, and I threw it into a canal ditch. And they were actually, then they went and they looked and they were able to actually find this inscribed boulder. And what you're looking at here is a type of hieroglyphic script. And you always think of hieroglyphs and you think of Egypt, but there was another type, completely unrelated hieroglyphic script in the ancient Middle East. And this was to record a language that was spoken in Anatolia, in Turkey, called Luvian. And Luvian is one of the earliest known Indo-European languages. And we were actually able to, when this was found, we notice this is very important here. We notice that this is the symbol for king, and then there's the king's name is given, and it's a king Hartapu, who is actually known from other sources. And what is being described here in this boulder, and it's interesting, part of it is incised and part of it isn't. We're not really sure what's going on here. Maybe this was a draft of a document that was not completed. But what's being described here is Hartapu's victory over 13 local kings. And this was evidence that we never had before for wars between Anatolian city-states in around 1000 BC. And so this is all very exciting, and it may even suggest that the site, because this boulder describes Hartapu's victories, that this might have been a royal capital of some kind. So we won't know more until we excavate the site, but it's very exciting to be off to a start like this in a brand new archaeological field project. So now we thought we would talk about some of our language projects. You remember how I described the OI as a half archaeological and half language based. And so here you have another one of these timelines for OI language projects. And again, what we're doing with these language projects is that we're finding things like that Hartapu inscription, and there are specialists like me who read the texts that archaeologists find, and we use these to reconstruct histories and religions and literatures and socioeconomic institutions. And what the OI is famous for are dictionaries. And currently we have three sort of major, in our history, three major dictionary projects. One that was finished well, relatively recently, the Chicago Demotic Dictionary, and this is, Demotic is a type of late period Egyptian writing. This was the smallest of these dictionaries. It was begun in the 80s. It just is finished up a few years ago. Now we're converting it so that it can be on the web. Another one is the Chicago Hittite Dictionary that was also begun, that also began in the 80s and probably will finish up sometime by the middle of this century, around 2050. These projects take a very long time. They're a major time commitment, and that is a language of Hittite, and Hittite is, like Luwian, one of the early Indo-European languages. And the biggest of them is the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, and this records the Babylonian and Assyrian languages that comprise the Akkadian. These were the major languages of ancient Mesopotamia. And the CAD was a massive project that just finished in 2011. It spanned 90 years and resulted in 26 volumes. And really, we call these, they're dictionaries, but really there's so much more than that, because they're not simply definitions in English of words, but they have quote from texts. They're sort of part of the decipherment effort itself. They quote extensively from texts. That's why a dictionary isn't a single volume, but 26 volumes, because it gives you all of the nuances of the words, how they were used over sometimes thousands of years, how they may have been used in literature, historical texts, and economic texts, and quoting from the original sources, which, you know, decades ago were very difficult to interpret, and quoting extensively from them. And really, they're really cultural encyclopedias, because they record so much rich information about these cultures. And this is really one of the landmark projects of the OI, the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, and probably, I think, no exaggeration to say, one of the greatest humanistic research efforts of the 20th century. Another textual project that we have that's a big part of what the OI does is Chicago House. And Chicago House is our permanent research base in Luxor, Egypt. So this is in southern Egypt. And we've had a headquarters there for now 96 years. So it was founded just a few years after the OI. And this is about a 4.5 acre campus right on the Nile. You can see this is what it looked like. This was taken, this footage is from the 30s. But that's what it looks like. It's, well, there are many more buildings there now. But this is a campus right on the Nile, right across from the Valley of the Kings and the Queens, and within walking distance of two massive temples, Karnak and Luxor temples. And what the work that's done there is not archaeological per se, but it's epigraphic. And by that we mean that it's used, what they do there is that they record all of the monuments of Karnak and Luxor temples and a few other places in that area. And we call these temples, but really they're almost like temple cities. These are massive structures if you ever go to Egypt, and virtually every inch of the surface of these buildings is covered in either artwork or inscriptions. And the work that they do at Chicago House is to record those inscriptions, which are actually quickly being lost because of climate change, and they're deteriorating very quickly there. And that's essentially the work that is done there. And Jean will talk a little bit more about what's done there. Sure, in more
recent times, I mean, the projects have, of course, evolved over the years. And so these days, an important part of working, or the work of Chicago House, is training Egyptian conservation students. And there's many small projects going on, and I'll just show you two of them. This one at Luxor Temple, which had a very long history, but under the Romans it was converted. It was no longer a temple, and it became a ceremonial hall. And at that time, the reliefs of the ancient Egyptian reliefs were plastered over, and these Roman frescoes were painted on the walls. And so now there's a mixture of both of them when you when you visit. And so what they're doing now is documenting not only here the Roman fresco part, but the relief that survives underneath it. And this will be the focus of a major publication when it's finished. And here at Medinet Habu, again, one of these projects that looks at the long history of these monuments. And here, there's a project where they're drawing and recording the later Demotic, Coptic, and figurative graffiti that was written on the walls of this temple.
So yeah, we wanted to conclude with some of our cultural heritage work, which is becoming increasingly a big part of what the OI does. It's something, cultural heritage is something that we care very deeply about and really has been part of the OI for decades. We participated, for instance, in a salvage excavation in Nubia in the 1960s for a dam that was being built to sort of save archaeological heritage there. We also were deeply involved in the looting of the Iraq Museum in 2003 and documenting what went missing from the museum. And really, almost all of our archaeological field projects have a cultural heritage dimension, and this can take various forms. One, it can simply mean protecting the archaeological sites. It can mean making the archaeological sites accessible to tourists, right, which help the local economies. And a big part of it also means training local conservators so that they can protect their own cultural heritage, because really these fields will only succeed elsewhere in the world if they succeed in their home countries. Most recently, our big cultural heritage, one of our big cultural heritage initiatives has been in Afghanistan. So it really represents an extension of where we work, right? The OI is primarily, it's the Middle East, but not Central Asia. But since 2012, we've been working very closely with the US Department of State to do work in Afghanistan. And this really began with work in the National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul, which has been decimated over the decades going back to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, but particularly in recent years, of course, by the Taliban. And this museum was terribly looted, but it was very hard to know what exactly was missing because the original records were in such disarray. And we've been there since 2012, working with the Department of State to reconstruct those records, figure out what has been lost, what's there, and help them create a up-to-date, state-of-the-art inventory of the museum. And this work has now spread up to several satellite projects. One of them is a mobile museum where you can imagine traveling to Kabul to see the museum can be very difficult. So what we did is we created a mobile museum with some objects, but in particular 3D prints of objects. And now this mobile museum can go out and it can go into villages and people can learn about their cultural heritage without coming to Kabul itself. And then there are some other aspects to this work that Jean will talk about.
Yeah, we just want to highlight one other. This is a map. And it's a bit of a simplified map, but what it is, all these red dots are archaeological sites and monuments in Afghanistan. And so this is a project that the OI has been working on with the Institute of Archaeology in Kabul. And the importance of documenting these sites is illustrated here. We look at these gray boxes or rectangles, and what these gray areas represent are areas of mining interest. And so knowing where the archaeological sites and monuments are, of course, is the first step in protecting them. And so this allows the Afghans to be better equipped to educate companies that want to come in and do mining and have other economic operations to help them be more aware of what areas need special protection because they're sites and monuments.
So I think this is where we'll end. There's a lot more to talk about, but we just wanted to give you an overview of the scope of our work and what we do. Thank you all for your attention, and I also wanted to point out that if you want to learn more about the OI, and we certainly hope that you do, especially at this pivotal moment of our centennial, we have a special centennial website that is will give you an overview of some of the projects that we talked about, and you can learn more, and that's at oi100.uchicago.edu, and you can also learn about all the events and programming that we have going on in Chicago this year. So Gene and I are really happy to answer any questions you might have, and thank you all for coming out on a Friday night and hearing our presentation. Yes?
Actually, I have two questions. One is, as you just mentioned, for example, this website is just for the centennial of your institute. Do you mean that, let's say, maybe next year or a few years later, if I want to get these information from this website that's no longer there? Why I ask this question is because actually, let's say, when I want to go to, let's say, those heritage places that you mentioned in your presentation, or maybe I go to your museum. Okay, I think definitely, especially going to your heritage site, all these introductions that you give in this presentation, you won't have it on a board in that site. You may have a very brief description, but that won't be very detailed.
Right.
So that, of course, somebody will just want to go there and then take a photo, that's all. But for those people, like me, I'm not studying in history or archaeology, etc. I'm only interested in history. Of course, if I is going to any of your site, well, I mean the heritage site or the museum, I would like more about a particular item.
Right.
Okay, then how can I get that information?
Okay, so we have two websites. This Centennial website is sort of a lot like this presentation to give a very broad audience, a very high-level introduction to the OI. But linked with this Centennial website is the OI's real website, which is a massive website, very scholarly with lots of information. It tends to overwhelm people, but it's for specialists and people who want a deeper dive into the material. And you can go from one website to they're linked, and you can go to the OI's real website, and on that website you'll find lots of information on all these projects. But not only that, but you'll be able to search our entire collection of artifacts. You'll be able to also even download. The OI has produced thousands of publications over 100 years, and every single one of our publications is available for free as a download. So anything that we have ever written about and published from anything from cultural heritage to the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary to any of the archaeological field projects, you can go into that website, you can search on it, and you can download those publications, which, you know, some of them are very expensive as books. You can always download the PDF for free. So there is a mechanism. You know, it's not for everybody. You know, it's probably for scholars and people who want an advanced knowledge. But all of that information can be found on the OI's main website.
When you have, I'm not a scholar. Can I get
anyone has access to that information. All you need is an internet connection.
Mm-hmm. Am I allowed to ask one more question?
Sure.
Regarding in the very last part of your presentation, you mentioned that the cultural heritage site actually they want at least they can attract some tourists to go there to help the local economy. I know that some of those, some people who are either in your field of archaeology or history, actually, they are a little bit against, especially those World Heritage sites, to attract tourists, because it will make it too commercialized. I just want to ask the personal view of you two, whether, of course, there's a balance, but do you think that on one hand, it becomes a World Heritage, as you just mentioned, you can raise the local economy, but on the other hand, definitely that will make it a little bit too commercial.
Right, that's a very good question, and people do debate the merits of that issue. That's rigorously debated. You know, I think, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, in the parts of the world that we work in the Middle East, the benefits far outweigh those types of negatives. And I think there's not, and often Egypt aside, but even Egypt, I would maybe not make that an exception. There's not really a worry of over-tourism. I think the Iraqis, for instance, are very, very keen on, for instance, Nippur becoming a World Heritage Site, and they've asked us for help getting this UNESCO inscription for Nippur. I think it's going to be hard to do. I think a place like Babylon has just gotten UNESCO World Heritage Site. But certainly when you go to Iraq, there's not a worry when you go to Babylon that it's going to be flooded with tourists, because these are parts of the world that obviously the average tourist isn't going to go to. And these also are places that need the most help. So I think making these sites accessible to tourists, and it also comes with protecting these sites as well, that the balance, there might be some negatives, but the positives far outweigh these in terms of protecting the sites, investing in these sites, and maybe attracting a little bit of tourism. And you look at a site like Babylon, that's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, or I was recently in Persepolis in Iran, which is a World Heritage Site, and you see how well maintained these sites are, what that investment means for these sites, just in terms of protecting them. There's very little question in my mind that it's a good idea to do so. Scholars also will have issues that once a site becomes a UNESCO World Heritage Site, you're more limited in the types of work that you can do there. But even in that instance, I'm in favor of it. Now it might be different in Italy or some other places, but in the Middle East, it's a net positive, I think. Yes?
I have a couple of questions. You kind of answered the first one. The first question has to do with the projects that has been done by the Institute in the past. Are they typically funded or initiated by the local communities and organizations or governments, or by the OI? So that's one. And then the other question has to do with possible collaborations with people or organizations in this part of the world, given your massive amount of expertise and probably a lot of resources at Yuen, and a lot of needs and opportunities in this part of the world. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, those two questions are closely related. So usually the way these projects work, they begin at least with an investment from the OI. And we either do that through, you might get a grant from the government to do work, or from a private foundation, or a gift, or we just, often it's part of the OI's budget is to conduct field work. So usually that investment typically it starts with the OI. The nature of collaborations has changed a lot over the years. And now, it used to be sort of almost a type of colonial model, right? Where Westerners would go into these countries and excavate, and there wouldn't be that much of an interaction with the local academic community, but that's really changed a lot, and it's continuing to change. So now it's not uncommon, for instance, when we have a field project, for there to be a co-director from the host country, an academic that's there, and often students from the host country will participate in these digs. And this is something that is very important. Not only is it the right thing to do, but we want these types of collaborations because you want to train the local expertise, right? Because these fields will not survive unless they thrive in the countries in which this work takes place. So it's a very important for the field as a long-term goal, and it should be that way. So virtually every project, I'd say every project has now local collaboration, and in some instances, that also comes with local funding as well, and it's a joint financial venture as well, as far as that's possible.
What about this part of the world? Any thoughts or hopes, or?
Well, it's different in different parts of. So, in a country like Turkey, it's mandated that there is this type of collaboration, and they have a long history of it. And other parts, it's sort of fair. It goes as the country goes, in terms of its economy and geopolitically. A place like Iraq, fieldwork is just starting, and so collaboration is, we want to see it, and we want to do some training, and we're going to foster that, but it will be on a different level than when you have in Turkey. In Egypt, there's quite a bit as well. So it's a goal, and in some cases it's better realized at this time than others, but everywhere we want to go, we want to train local scholars, we want to collaborate with local universities, and very importantly, we want to train conservators and museum professionals to help protect these sites.
Yes. Curious about Tehran's claims against the OI?
Well, Tehran doesn't have any claims against the OI. I was just in Tehran 2 weeks ago, and that's the issue I think that you're probably referring to is the issue of the Persepolis fortification tablets. And these were tablets that were excavated from, Jean described the excavations of Persepolis in the 1930s. They were on loan to the OI since the 1930s. There was a prominent legal case against these tablets in the United States, and the University of Chicago fought that lawsuit to protect those tablets rigorously, taking the case all the way to the Supreme Court, spent millions of dollars to protect this cultural heritage with the Iranians. So this wasn't a case of United States against the Iran, but Iran and Iran, the US government, and the University of Chicago all on the same page to protect this cultural heritage. And we won that lawsuit, and we promised to return those tablets, as was always the plan since the 1930s. And I was in Iran 2 weeks ago to deliver the first batch of those tablets, over 1,700 of those, making good on that promise. So.
Why has it taken so long?
Well, you could not, well, the lawsuit was settled last year, so nothing could happen while these were tied up in litigation. And as soon as the lawsuit was settled, it was as soon as we won the lawsuit, that very day I wrote personally to the Iranians saying that I wanted to return the tablets. But returning tablets that are fragile, thousands of pieces, you need a license from the government to do that. That takes months to do it, and they have to be packed with great care, and the logistics of shipping objects of that value from the United States in particular to Iran is no trivial matter. So within a year they went back, and that was as fast as it was humanly possible.
How long will the whole process take?
It'll probably take a few years because you need subsequent licenses to do these. And as soon as I got back from Iran, we applied for the second license. So once that license materializes, and that's something we have no control over, that's something the US government issues, we'll return the others. So we had a large press conference in Tehran a few weeks ago, and I think the Iranians are pleased with how the return of the tablets is moving forward. Any other questions?
A quick one. I guess the pace of geopolitical movements in that part of the world probably has accelerated quite a bit. So as you are managing your ongoing projects or exploring new projects, I'm just curious whether just how closely do you keep track of those events or your ability to predict those, whether it's a change in military moves by the U.S. government or the changing winds of diplomatic forces there. I assume that all your projects last decades, but it seems like the pace of changing directions, whether strategy by the political or military leaders could change overnight or within a matter of weeks.
I'll let Gina answer the difficult question.
No, I mean, that certainly happens. And if you look at the history of ancient Middle Eastern archaeology, it certainly moves from region to region. So just for an example, like a personal example, I myself was really active in archaeology in Syria. And there were a lot of digs going on in Syria. And there was a real concentration of activity there, and that was up until 2010. And then there have been no archaeological projects there since. People seem to be able to start thinking about, as we did, going back now to southern Iraq and digging some of the sites there, which, as we were saying, haven't really been dug for about 30 years. I think that certainly from an archaeological perspective, the strategy changes. You can no longer think about, you plan for the ideal project and you want it to go on for many years, but you have to conduct each season understanding that the situation might change. And so I think what that has resulted in possibly is a bit of a more efficient process, because you can't really think that the things you're finding one year, maybe if you don't finish something that season, you can finish it the next year. You want to think strategically over a long-term plan, but you want to break it into manageable parts so that your work you don't leave work unfinished, that you can't make something of the time that you're able to have at a site. And so, like I said, things do move around in the focus of the field work. And not only that, policies can change. That's certainly the case, for example, in Turkey, where it's much more difficult now than it was even, I would say, 5 to 7 years ago. It's much more difficult now to get a project started. And there are rules and guidelines that are now in place that weren't in place before. So I think there's always challenges, and I do think it changes constantly, and it can change rather frequently. And so you just have to be strategic in the way you plan your archaeology if you really want to continue conducting field work.
So does that also mean that the efficiency of archaeologists have also gone up dramatically?
Well, the problem, things have changed dramatically. I mean, you can ask really important research questions nowadays with the scientific methodologies available, where you're not moving the same amount of dirt that you were moving in some of these archival photos we show you, where like everybody has a shovel and is digging, and there's hundreds of workmen. I mean, you could spend a summer or a season excavating, a 1 by 1 square meter part of a courtyard, where you go down through the floors, and you could do microstratigraphy and figure out what they're doing on each of the floors by this really small debris that's left behind. So, it's just, I wouldn't say that archaeologists move faster, but they're more efficient in focusing in on the research questions they want answered, because you don't know how much time you'll have. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Well, thank you again. Really a pleasure to come out here. Thank you so much. Thank you.